right, everybody, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Just a couple administrative things. We really like to keep track of the interest in these talks and to keep track of who is interested in these talks. So if you don't mind signing in, there's a sign-up sheet over there before you leave. Just sort of name what part of the university you're affiliated with, and then your email address, so we can contact you about future talks. So this is the, oh yeah, and then after the talk, please stick around. We'll have food and drinks, we'll have a reception. You can talk more with the speaker or with each other, or you can just hang out and eat pizza. But please stay. So this is the second and final talk in our CompBio seminar series for this semester, but we'll be scheduling more for the fall, so please keep an eye out for that. We'll put them online and we'll send email reminders as well. But today we're delighted to have Dr. Lex Flagel. So Dr. Flagel is originally from North Dakota, did his undergrad at Minnesota. PhD at Iowa State, did a postdoc at Duke, and then went to work for originally Monsanto, now Bayer in Minnesota, where he's also adjunct at the University of Minnesota. And he does some really interesting work with machine learning and deep learning as it's applied to genomics, crop breeding, and evolutionary biology. So great, take it away. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for the. Yeah. Well, anyway, I was gonna thanks for the introduction and thanks guys for having me down here. I'm excited to be here. Jeremy kind of highlighted my somewhat unusual both industry and academia. So I'm an adjunct professor at Minnesota, which means I have an office on campus. I don't take students or have a lab, but I have a full-time job in bear crop science. And in my full-time job, I do crop genetics, statistical genetics. So basically, I analyze data sets and provide breeders with information that helps them identify mostly corn and some soy plants, what they're going to advance. And in that work, we use a lot of machine learning. And in my kind of university life, I took some of the things I learned from machine learning, like the basic skills, and applied them to an area I'm really interested in, which is evolutionary biology, which is where my PhD and postdoc work were in. And so this talk is really about work that I've done kind of more on the academic side, applying deep learning methods to evolutionary biology. And I am going to give probably about a 75% sort of teaching talk where I'm going to try to demystify and explain the basics of deep learning. And then about a quarter at the end, maybe the last 10 or 15 minutes, I'll sort of touch on this very specific use that I applied deep learning to area called population genetics. So actually, I just kind of talked through this. So my goals really are to introduce deep learning and then discuss how we can use it in some areas in evolutionary biology. I think before I dive in, I want to sort of demystify something that I certainly struggled with. So I have a genetics background. I got involved in deep learning when I came to industry. I had no training in it. In fact, I don't even think I'd heard the term before I started at Monsanto in 2012. And one of the barriers to getting into deep learning is that or machine learning in general, there's a lot of jargon. People use a lot of terms. And so I thought I'd just put a kind of map of my understanding of some of this jargon. So machine learning is a really big field that uses a lot of different algorithms to make inferences from data, basically, to identify patterns in data. Deep learning is a particular type of machine learning. So when you hear machine learning, that's kind of a generic term for a lot of different approaches. Deep learning is a more specific term that really only applies to, is generally only applied to neural networks, which is a type of machine learning. And I'll talk more about this in a minute. And then sometimes in the media or in different areas, you'll hear this term artificial intelligence or AI. As near as I can tell, it completely lacks a technical definition. It's just kind of a catch-all term or sometimes a marketing term that people use that may refer to one or any number of these approaches or a bunch of other things that people want to slap the AI title on. But anyway, just to kind of get you oriented, we'll spend most of our time in this area. But I think before we go to that, I want to kind of define the broader area of machine learning and what the goals are and why we use it in industry and why people use it in academia and in research. So this is my definition of machine learning. It's basically an algorithm that allows a computer to extract information from data and do something useful. And the learning part comes from this extracting information from data. So it's really not learning the way we learn. It's learning more in you give the machine learning algorithm some data and it finds patterns in it, right? But colloquially, we call this learning. And so one example is, here's a XY scatter plot. You've probably all seen these the dots have been fit with a linear regression or a best fit line. And by my definition of machine learning, this statistical technique, linear regression, could be definitely, it satisfies this whole definition, right? Like the algorithm, because regression is an algorithm at some level, it's extracted information from these data points and it's doing something useful, right? So for every value of X, I can make a prediction of what Y would be by looking at this linear line. Other people tend not to include linear regression in machine learning, but I think it's perfectly reasonable. And it's a very simple, maybe one of the simplest examples you can give of a machine learning approach. So I just told you, okay, most of you have done linear regression. I just told you, by the way, now that's machine learning. And you're like, well, great, I already knew how to do linear regression, so why do I need this thing? This sounds like just a bunch of jargon. So let me try to set up where machine learning really comes in. So in the classic sort of inference, well, think about this as like a computer program. So in a classic kind of inference mode, if I gave you some data and a problem, you'd write down the rules, you'd encode the rules in a computer program, and then for a given data, your program would come up with answers. So like, here's a problem. I give you the radius of a circle, and I say, write a computer program that can compute the area of the circle. Well, we have very classic rules for that. The area is, pi times the radius squared. I think all of you could write a simple computer program that, given some data on radiuses, and you could encode these rules, and you could come up with the answers. That's a kind of problem that typically machine learning isn't involved in. But the kind of problem that we tend to tackle more with machine learning are problems where the rules are really hard to write down. So here are, I don't know, about 10 or 12 pictures. Half are cats, half are dogs. I think we could all look at them and agree, yeah, those are cats, yeah, those are dogs. And we'd have almost perfect agreement in this room. And now if I asked you, okay, now write a set of rules or write a computer program or some logic or a series of equations, and I'm going to give you one of these pictures, or I'm going to give you a new picture of a cat or dog, and your code, your program, your rules need to produce the right answer. They need to either say cat or dog. If you think that through, you'll pretty quickly come to the conclusion that that's a really hard task, right? Like, you might say, oh, well, cats have kind of pointy ears and dogs have floppy ears, but of course there's dogs with pointy ears, and here's a picture of a cat with no ears, so that already breaks that rule, right? And so you'd have to write like all these rules and then sort of sub-rules for all the rules, and very quickly you'll completely give up on trying to solve this problem. This is where we need machine learning. And if you get nothing else out of this talk, hopefully this is the point I can hammer home. Machine learning inference is different from classic inference because the rules are undefinable, or at least so complicated that we can't define them. And in machine learning, what you do is instead you have data and answers, right? So we had data and rules that gave us answers. Now we start with data and answers, and we produce rules. And so in this case, what we would do is we would sit down with several hundred pictures of cats and dogs, and we would label them by human labels. We'd write cat, dog, and we'd feed those to the computer, and the computer would look at the pictures, and it would identify patterns in the pictures, and it would say, okay, well, this one should be cat, so I need to identify a picture or I need to identify patterns in that picture that tell me that that's a cat. And after training on hundreds or maybe thousands of these labeled pictures, it would produce rules. Now we would have what we call a trained machine learning algorithm. We could take those rules and we plug them back in here, and now with new data, those would be like new pictures of cats and dogs. Once we train the algorithm, we're kind of back in the classic inference land, and now our algorithm is producing answers. And so this is where we need machine learning. We need it in all these cases where we simply can't construct logic or rules that will make the inference for us. And it's not, I'll show in a minute, but you can probably all extrapolate. This isn't specific just to labeling pictures. This is true of genetic inference and all kinds of different fields where we have these problems that are really tough to define rules for, but we want to know what the answer is. Another piece of jargon that machine learning people use a lot, and I may slip into a little bit, is how we talk about data. So this is a data set. It's actually Fisher's iris data, kind of a famous biological data set. And it's presented to you in a way that most biologists or statisticians are used to. You've got your individuals on the rows. You've got phenotypes, columns of phenotypes on the columns, or some categorical variables like the species. Machine learning people will refer to the columns as features. So you'll hear, how many features is in this model or something. And what they mean is how many columns of measurable things did you collect for your data set? And then they will refer to an individual row as the feature vector. That is, it's the collection of all the features for one observation. And so this is basically just a piece of jargon that puts labels on things that we've always called, the columns and the rows of your data set. And the final thing I want to say sort of about jargon and about features is that it's not limited to just direct observable things like the number of petals on a plant or something like that. There's a lot of work in extracting features from data and sort of coming up with clever techniques and summarizations to get data sets into a feature vector. So this is a chemical. Obviously, this doesn't fit cleanly into a spreadsheet. There's no real easy way to just put this chemical into a spreadsheet, but people, like in chemistry, have found a somewhat useful approach is to characterize the number of carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygens, so you can count those, and then this carbon-carbon single bonds, there's 8 carbon-nitrogen single bonds and so on, and then carbon-oxygen double bonds, there's this one here. And that this is a feature that gives sort of a signature for this chemical and contains some of the properties of this chemical, and now it's in a format, if we had a bunch of chemicals, where we could say we have sort of our features, and this is the feature vector for this particular chemical. The final thing about machine learning that comes up quite a bit is overfitting. So the algorithms that can, given data and given answers, can produce rules are really powerful algorithms. They're really good at pattern detection, but they're so powerful that in many cases they'll memorize your data. So you feed them your training data, and instead of actually learning general properties about what identifies dogs and cats, they can often be so powerful that they'll simply memorize from the training data all the pictures that were dogs and all the pictures that were cats. And what happens then is they overfit for that specific data set, and they won't generalize very well to other pictures of dogs and cats. So they're kind of stuck in a very local optima for that particular data set, but not an optima that's going to be more useful for a larger data set. And so the way machine learning people guard against this overfitting problem is you take sort of all your data, you can imagine this is all of our dog and cat pictures, and we label a fraction of them. Usually it's a small fraction, 5%, 10%, 20%, and we leave the rest unlabeled. We'll deal with these later. And we take then a fraction of the labeled ones, and we train the machine learning algorithm with it, and then we leave some out, like a third or something like that. And we use those to test the trained algorithm. So we've trained the algorithm. We think it does pretty well. It's trained pretty well, but it's never seen these test samples before. We'll feed those in, and we know the true answer because we labeled these, and we'll see how well it generalizes to this test data. And this is kind of the main technique to identify when a model's been overfit. It's when it does really well on the training data and really poorly on the test data. And then if that occurs, we have to go back to training, and we have to think about ways to improve the training so that we don't get this overfitting problem. And eventually, once we get training and testing results to be quite similar and we're satisfied with the model, then we can apply it to all of the unlabeled data, and it will generate new labels for us. Okay, so that's kind of some jargon and some background. So now I want to spend quite a few minutes talking about what a deep neural network is, and I'm going to introduce this. Hopefully, you've got a little bit of background in math and maybe a little bit in stats, but this is a very sort of generic, if you've never heard of deep learning or never looked at it before, this may be a good generic introduction to the idea. So this is a small deep neural net, and I'll give you some of the kind of the basics. So it flows, information in this network flows from left to right. This is the input layer here on the left, and this input layer, you can think of it as a feature vector, right? So each of these black circles is a number, maybe from a spreadsheet, that's going to go into this neural network. And in this case, the neural network, these black dots on the inside are artificial neurons, and we'll break one of those apart in a minute, and we'll talk about what's inside of it. But for right now, just understand that numbers from the input layer, they flow into every one of the neurons at the first layer. And these neurons are going to process those numbers and transform them into different numbers, and they're going to pass them to every other neuron in the second hidden layer. And those in turn are going to process them to the third layer. Finally, we get an output layer, and this is the result we're looking for. And in this particular neural network, what's happening is we have an input layer of size 8. The neurons are going to transform the data, and they're going to make an output of size 4. And really what's just happening is numbers go in, stuff happens to the numbers inside here, the new numbers come out, and the size transforms. And the reason this is called a deep neural network is because there are more than one hidden layers. If I only had one hidden layer, if I had input, hidden layer, output, that would be a normal neural network or just a neural network. But if I add more than one of these, the word for that is deep. And that's where deep learning comes from. It just means a neural net with extra hidden layers. So let's pick apart one of these neurons. So this is kind of what they look like on the inside. So now I'm taking just one of those neurons and one of those 3 hidden layers, and I've sort of exploded it. These are the inputs. Remember we talked about, just a number. And each input that goes into the neuron has a weight associated with it. So this input has a specific weight, and that's just a number, another number, and so on. And every input has one weight. And what we do is we multiply all the inputs by the corresponding weight. So we multiply input x sub 0 by weight 0 and so on, and then we sum all those up. So it's just if this first input was 3 and the first weight was 4, that's 12, and we're going to add that to the product of the next input by the next weight and so on. And in this toy example here, let's say that the sum is equal to 3.5. So it's just a number. Next, there's this term called the bias, and I'm not going to explain what this does now, but every neuron has one bias. So every neuron has as many weights as it has inputs, but it only ever has one bias. And we're simply going to take this sum, and we're going to add the bias to it. And in this case, I just made up a number. The bias is negative 1.2, so 3.5 plus negative 1.2 is equal to 2.7. So that just gives us a number. And now we're going to pass this through something called the activation function. There are different flavors of these. By far the most popular one today is this one called a ReLU. And it's a really simple function. It's just either you take the value, it's a function where either you give the maximum value of 0 or the input value, right? And so this produces a graph like this. If the value is less than 0, it's going to always output 0. If the value is more than 0, it just outputs the value. So it's kind of a boring function, and you can write it down as it's just max 0 or 2.7, which was our sum of the weights times the inputs plus the bias. And in this case, this neuron is going to output 2.7. So this is the whole flow of information to this neuron. We had 3 inputs, 3, 1, and a half, and given some weights and a bias, this neuron is going to output 2.7. That's it. And the reason they're called neurons is there's kind of an analogy here to a biological neuron, like in your brain. It takes inputs from other neurons in your brain, and it can either decide to fire or not fire. And not firing would be something like emitting a 0, right? Or it can fire a lot or just a little bit, right? It can decide how strong to fire, and that's like the magnitude of this value, basically. And so inside each of these neurons, there's some sort of logic with these weights and biases that just decides how to take these set of inputs and make a particular output. And the key here is that this neuron can transform the inputs into any positive output or 0 by just adjusting the weights and the bias, right? So if I made this bias a super large negative number, then this neuron will never do anything unless the inputs are huge, right? And you can imagine a case where I could create some kind of logic where, like, this input I think is going to be, if I want to ignore things, I'm going to make this weight a huge negative number, right? And so this input, whenever it's a value, a large value, it's going to be multiplied by a huge negative number. It's going to make this some negative, and it's always going to shut that neuron off, right? But I could counteract that by making this input, this weight, a huge positive number, right? And so now when there's an input here, it can counteract the effect of this big negative here, and you can get these kind of complex and interesting interplays. And you can imagine that. not good. What did I do? HDMI, do you know what I have to press? I hit the wrong button.
So hit the bottom button.
Okay, sorry.
All you do is black out the screen.
Yep. And so yeah, you can imagine the interplay of this on a large network like this. You have all these offsetting things, right? And these weights start to kind of come into effect. And so that's the basic function inside of one of these neurons. And I think to really see it in action, I should play a video. Do you know how I get back to the, let's see, probably escape. Yeah. All right. And I should have a video here, because I think this will make more sense if I just show you an example.
So go to desktop. We put it on the desk.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
There it is.
Okay. So here's a clip. This is from a really cool video you can find on YouTube by kind of an artist and mathematician guy named 3 Blue 1 Brown. And so what this is it's a artificial neural network that he trained. So all the weights and biases have been set. And what it does is in the upper left-hand corner is the number 7, right? A handwritten number 7. And it's in a 28 by 28 grid of pixels. 28 squared is 784. So the input of this neural network is 784, which the values correspond to each of the pixels in that grid. And you have 2 hidden layers. So this is a deep neural network, each with 16 neurons. And then you have an output of size 10, which corresponds to each of the 9 handwritten digits that this thing was trained on. And what we would want this network to do, given the pixel intensities over there that are going to come in on the left, we want these 2 rows of hidden neurons to transform that so that they light up the biggest number in this 7 place, right? So we want the output to be big here and small everywhere else. And that's our neural network telling us that it thinks that this is a 7. And now watch as a few numbers flow through this, and you'll just see how the neurons, he uses color to light up the intensity of the neuron. So if the neuron stays black, that means it's outputting a 0. And if it gets a big bright, I think it's like a greenish yellow color, that means that neuron is firing. And so now you can see kind of how information flows to give us a 7, and that's the correct output. So now is a 2, and so it's a different input structure. Different stuff happens internally in the network, and it outputs a 2 up there at the top, and the final one is a 1. And all this is the correct adjustment of the weights and the biases in this network so that the thing will output the value we want. I'll let it play maybe one more time just so you can see it sort of flow through. So notice those patterns in the inside of the network. Certain neurons are detecting certain things in that picture. And now when we get to the 2, you should see that it's a different pattern. Different neurons lit up. They're detecting something different about that. And that all winds its way into making the 2 light up instead of the 7. And so that static view that I showed you like this is kind of hard to see how it worked, but hopefully that video makes it a little clearer, like, okay, so the goal here, the whole game is to set these weights and biases so that the thing can do something interesting. And so then I thought, I'll play around with maybe the simplest neural network I could think about making. So this neural network takes in an input value of a number, we'll just call it x, and what I wanted to do is output pi times x. And I made the smallest deep neural network you can possibly make, which is takes your input x, has 2 neurons that are connected to each other, there's weight and a bias and another weight and another bias, and then it outputs pi x. And I just want to show you in this simple case that we can literally write down the equation. So first, we're going to take x and we're going to multiply it by weight 1, and we're going to add bias 1 to it, right? So that's the first part of the network. And hopefully this can explain the bias term a little bit. So you guys have seen the equation for a line, right? It's y equals ax plus b. So this looks a lot like that, right? This is kind of ax, so that's like the weight. You can think of it as like the slope, right? So it's adjusting, up or down. Does this thing point which direction the line points in? And if you remember, this is the intercept, right? So once the slope is fixed, this thing tells it, is it high on the line or low? That's exactly what the bias term does in a neural network. It basically, once the weight has adjusted the value, kind of the slope, the bias term basically is used by the neural network to sort of rescale this neuron, especially in the context when you have lots of neurons. You need them to sort of be on the same scale, right? Because they start interacting with one another. You don't want one to be on the millions and billions scale and one to be on like the tens or hundreds scale. So these biases can allow you to sort of rescale everything. All right, and then remember we talked about this ReLU function. It's just the max of 0 or this value. So that's the output of the first neural network, or sorry, of the first neuron. And now that's going to get passed as the input to the second neuron. And it's going to get multiplied by weight 2, and we're going to add the bias, and then we have to wrap another ReLU function around it. So the point here is that this, and then this should approximately equal x times pi. That's our goal. But the point of this isn't to show you this map. It's just literally to show you that you can write down a neural network as a function or as an equation, right? So you can take a neural network and just write it into computer code as an equation, a pretty, in this case, a small equation. Imagine now we get to something like, oops, where was my big picture? Here, right? So this one's going to be a huge equation, right? Like this would take pages and pages of paper, but there's literally 3 functions. You need to multiply, you need to be able to add, and you need to be able to take the max. And if you can do those 3 things, you can encode this entire neural network, or that one that transformed the handwritten digits. You could write that whole thing down as just one really long, awful equation with those 3 basic functions. And so if there's a second point you take from this talk, it's just that anytime you see someone talk about a deep neural network, they're literally just talking about a big, ugly, unwieldy mathematical equation, but nothing more. There's no magic. Okay, so back to our neural net. So we have this, we put in pi, we put in x, and we want pi x to come out. You can kind of reason, so that I told you the trick is to adjust these weights and the biases, and we have 4 of them. If you look at this long enough, you can kind of figure out what a good setting for the weights and biases might be to take x in and to make pi x come out. I couldn't figure it out, so I just made one and ran it. And the first time I ran it, what it did after I trained it, so I generated lots of values of x, multiplied them by pi, and I fed them both to the neural network, and I said, here's an x, here's this corresponding pi x. You learn the weights and the biases such that you can produce the right output given this equation. And the first time I did it, it said weight 1 should be 2.41, that's here, and weight 2 should be 1.31, and I'm going to set both the biases to 0. So it started with sort of random values, and these are the values it settled on. And then the next time I ran it, it picked these 4 values, and again, it crushed the weight of the biases both to be 0. And then I stared at these for a while, because I couldn't figure out what was going on, and then it dawned on me that if you multiply 2.41 by 1.31, that gives you a value really close to pi. If you multiply 1.57 by 2, that also gives you a value really close to pi. And here's what the neural network was doing. So and then it got rid of the biases, so those drop out of the equation, right? So these 2 terms drop out, and all you're left with are these max of 0. Well, these are always going to be positive as long as x is positive, and I always use a positive x. So these max terms drop out, and so literally all that's left is W2 times x times W1, right? So it's an equation with 3 variables. And what the neural network learned is that I can pick 2 weights, and as long as they're on this red line, if weight 1 is 2 and weight 2 is 1.57, that's going to multiply really close to pi, and that's going to give me the right answer. But I could also pick like the obvious one, 3.1415 and 1, which is right here. So no matter where I start this neural network, this really simple one, it just picks 2 weights so that they fall on this line, and it makes the biases drop out. And then any value, it's like multiplying it by 2 partial factors of x that when multiplied together, partial factors of pi that when multiplied together give you pi. And there's kind of a deeper, the reason I'm walking you through all this is there's a deeper point. The neural network didn't learn pi, like the Greeks learned pi. They understood something fundamental about the relationship between the circumference of a circle and the radius. The neural network just took data and it found some convenient solution that gave the right answer, but it has no deep insight or understanding about the meaning of pi, right? It just figured out, oh, if I multiply 2 by 1.57, I'm getting an answer that's close to what he wants, and that's it. And this is actually shown to be true for much more complicated problems, so like cat and dog pictures. If you train a neural network on a certain set of cat and dog pictures, you'll get a certain set of weights and biases. If you start over from a new random position and you train it again, you'll get a new set of weights and biases. Neither of those 2 weights or biases, sets of weights and biases, hold any deep sort of fundamental information about what it is to be a cat or what it is to be a dog. They're just convenient solutions that make the math work out so that it gets the answer right. And this is why some people refer to these deep learning methods as black box methods. It's because there's not sort of like, at least we don't yet know how to get deep fundamental insights out of them. We just know that they can produce useful results, but they don't, those results are somewhat arbitrary. If you start over from a new location, you'll get some new set of results, and they'll work just about as well. And it's like this example with pi. There's a ridge here, and anything on this red line, anything on this ridge is an equally valid solution. There's also, for cat and dog pictures, in some complicated way, there's a ridge probably of different ways you can set the weights and biases up that will also produce decent answers. And the final thing about these deep neural networks is sort of how they learn. So, we knew about neural networks since the 1950s. People had been playing with these models since really before there were useful computers. But they never really took off until the last 10 or 12 years. And it was because everyone knew they could do this, that everyone knew that they could encode logic and they could do complex analysis of data, but no one ever could figure out for any good size neural network how to ever set the weights and biases to useful values. And that was really cracked in a serious way just in the last 10 or 15 years. And the basic approach, I'll tell you the basic approach, which is not exactly what happens under the hood in today's deep learning, but it'll at least get you started, is what they do is you'll take that equation that I wrote down, but imagine it's much larger, right? And you'll take what's called the partial derivative of that. So you'll find, let's say we're going to try to optimize weight 1. So I'll take some input data and I'll fix all of the other weights for the moment. I'll just fix them at whatever values they're at. So they have some arbitrary numbers. I'll keep them there, but I'll take the derivative of weight 1 with respect to that, and I'll figure out the derivative, right, is like the tangent line of the slope at the moment, for that particular snapshot in time. And let's say this is weight 1. Right now it's set to 2.0, and I take the derivative, the partial derivative, and I notice it's pointing like steep downhill and to the right. That means that that weight will be more optimum if I were to move it to the right. So I had the weight at 2, and I say, okay, set it to 4. And now I recalculate the result, and now I notice that the derivative points down and to the left. And so that tells me, okay, when I went from 2 to 4, I overshot, so the optimum must be somewhere between 2 and 4. You can think of it like a ball rolling down a hill, and we want to get it in this basin. So I overshot, so I went from 2, now I go back to 2.5. Now I undershot again, but only by a little bit, and the derivative tells it's flattening out. And finally I get to this 4th stage, and I get a derivative that's really flat, and that tells me, okay, that weight is really close to an optimum. And that's easy enough to do when you only have one weight. When you have hundreds or thousands of, or even, now they're doing neural networks with literally like 1 billion, I think, at Google and stuff. This starts to break down. And so if you really want to read into the details, there's 2 algorithms they use. One's called backpropagation, and that's how you do this partial derivative trick. And then the gradient descent they use is a thing called stochastic gradient descent. So if you really want to geek out about exactly how this works, there's 2 terms you can Google and you can read more about. But at some very abstract high level, it's just this trick of figuring out the calculus. So really deep neural networks are, if you can add, multiply, find the max, and you know a little bit about derivatives, you basically have all the math to do deep learning. That's pretty much everything you need to know. There's a lot of algorithmic engineering to make it all come together, but the math is quite simple. And so that's a little bit about kind of the basic, kind of a basic introduction to deep learning. The other thing I didn't mention here, but I'll say, is that for large data sets, this becomes computationally really large. Calculating all these derivatives and doing this gradient descent and stuff is like, ends up being matrix algebra with lots and lots of very large matrices. And the way people do this now is with a GPU, or a graphics processor unit, instead of a CPU. So a lot of the back-end engineering now takes place on these GPUs, which are like graphics cards in computers. And so basically, if you have a graphics card and you kind of understand this basic matrix approach to these 2 algorithms, you can do deep learning. So I think maybe I'll pause for just a moment. I'm going to switch now to kind of the applied part where I started using this in evolutionary biology. But maybe if there's any kind of questions, I could take a question or 2 before I move on, because the talk kind of swaps to a different
I have a
section.
few actually.
Sure.
So who determines like how many layers to use, how many neurons in each layer, and like how many data points you need to make the learning work?
It's a great question. The answer is no one knows. There is like no theory. No one's been able to work out. So what you're talking about is neural network, they call it architecture. Do I have a lot of little layers with few neurons? Do I have a few layers with tons of neurons? There's a lot of, there's been a lot of trial and error, and there are experts who can kind of tell you, oh, for that problem, it tends to work better if you do this, or it tends to go better if you do that. But there's no like no one's ever worked out any kind of theory or equation where you say, oh, you're doing the dog-cat problem, just crunch these numbers and it'll tell you the right network architecture. No one's figured this out. And in fact, what people have started doing in the last couple of years is what they call random. So there's two things people have been doing. One is they're doing machine learning to design deep neural networks. So they have neural networks that design neural networks and learn basic properties. So it gets like really meta. So that's one approach people are using. There's another one that companies have started to use, which is random network architecture. So they don't even stick to this layered approach. Like this is nice and clean and layered. They start rewiring them in random ways. So this neuron here starts talking to that one and it skips over this whole layer. And this one talks to this one back to that one and then over to that or whatever. And that's a little bit more like how our brain works. Our neurons in our brain aren't layered in like nice clean rows. They're all kind of crazy, interacting. And they found that by making random networks, sometimes they'll make like 100 of them and they'll find one that works really well. And the question is why, and we don't know. And so yeah, it's a super interesting area of study, but we really don't have any handle on how that works. And that's a big difference between statistics, right? Like in stats, one of the main goals of stats is not to get the answer, but to tell you why the thing gave you. This is the minimum variance predictor for your problem, right? And we can explain with equations exactly why it works. This is a case where we don't have any of that. You're completely, at the moment, your best bet is to ask experts and fiddle around with different things. Try extremes.
It's not really important how many neurons or layers, as long as it does a good job with prediction,
yeah,
right?
Exactly, right. It's all very like outcome based. Like the justification is basically, yeah, look, it worked really well. You know what I mean? Like it's not, there isn't there's a lot of active research in that area. But at the moment, anyone who tells you they know the right architecture for a network, you should probably not trust them completely. They probably have good instincts, but they may be proven to be quite wrong in 5 years. Yeah.
So do you have any difficulty solving the gradient descent algorithm near the zero?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there are a lot of little traps inside these neural networks. This ReLU function has, if I could go back to, I'm sorry, I'm kind of jumping around slides here. This function, so there are two types of, there are multiple types of activation functions, and each of them presents its own problem. This particular one I don't think has a problem near zero, because you can pick up, it's either zero or it's some small positive value. But there are other types of activation functions which they have different shapes basically, and they start to have big problems near zeros, and they call this the vanishing gradient problem. This particular activation function helps a lot against vanishing. We're getting pretty deep into this stuff, but it protects a little bit against vanishing gradients. But this function, this activation function presents a different problem, which is called the dead ReLU problem, which is basically like you'll have a neural network with like 100,000 neurons, and 80,000 of them will never ever output anything but zero, no matter what you put into it. So they start to drop. They basically get stuck in this long zero bound over here, and gradient descent can't sort of bounce them back into the active range. And so this one doesn't have the zero gradient issue, but it has its own set of issues. And no one's ever devised the perfect activation function that always works well. There's always trade-offs.
Because the derivative of that function on zero will be discontinuous. I don't know if it will make a jump in your algorithm or not.
That I honestly don't know the exact answer to that. The derivative of this thing is kind of weird, right? Because it has a max in it, so it's actually sort of undefined. But there's a way to get around that. You have to take it in the context of the rest of the network too, right? You're not taking the derivative of just this one thing. You're taking it as a partial across the entire function. But yeah, good question. I honestly don't know the exact engineering that goes on inside this, finding these derivatives.
When you do the algorithm, how do you know that when it's good to stop the algorithm?
Also, totally undefined. So usually what you do is you run it on all your training data, you test it on your testing data, and then you say, that wasn't that great. So you run it again on all your training data, which means the weights and the biases jostle around again, and they get a little bit better. And you test it on the test data. You do this over and over, multiple sort of iterations of this. And what you really watch is how much is it improving on the test data. And if you sort of plot that over time, usually it'll asymptote and it'll stop. And then once it starts overfitting, it'll actually start to do poorer on the testing data. You know what I mean? The data you held out that it's never seen before. So you run it and you can kind of see that it hit a peak and then it starts to fall off. And that's because it's now overfitting. It's memorizing the training data. And sometimes if you run it multiple times, you'll see that it consistently hits that same peak. And that gives you a sense that for that architecture of that network, I can stop it at that peak, right? And you can kind of program that in and say, okay, if you get above 88% accuracy, I've never achieved anything better than that, just stop there and we'll move on. Some things are defined in the field, like, sometimes the person in the field says, I won't take the algorithm unless it's 95% accurate. So once it hits 95%, you can stop. For some applications, that's good enough. But there is no defined clear criteria for when it's perfectly trained, And you're often doing this at the same time as changing the architecture, right? So you have like 10 different neural networks and you'll train them all and you'll see which ones start working and you'll stop training the ones that aren't getting a good value and stuff like that. All right. Yep.
So I think you are talking about supervised learning. You are using that, right?
That's right.
So
Yep.
some of biomedical data actually doesn't have a clear label.
Right.
Right. In that case, I will move to the unsupervised learning or tweaking.
Yeah. So there's a whole. So this is called supervised learning. That's where that's the example where you provide the data and the answer. There's a whole field called unsupervised learning where you just provide the data and maybe some, guidelines or something, or sometimes nothing. And there's a whole branch of machine learning in that area. I'm not dealing with that directly here. This is all supervised learning. But yeah, there are applications. There are a lot of interesting applications in biomedicine and in genomics that are unsupervised learning, where we can't provide a label. We can't say that's definitely a dog and that's definitely a cat. Yeah. And that's a whole, you could do a whole PhD. It's a pretty interesting and deep branch of machine learning that, I'll be honest, I don't fully understand. I've done a lot more of the supervised learning. Uh-oh, stuck. All right, maybe I'll move on then to the second quarter of the talk, let's say. So this is kind of my journey into deep learning. So I went to a conference maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and I saw this guy, Dan Schreider. He was a postdoc then. He's a professor now at UNC Chapel Hill. Give a talk about a system he was working on. So he was studying fruit flies, and specifically he was looking at these fruit flies that are native to the Seychelles. They're a chain of islands that are sort of off of Africa, just north of Madagascar. And there's an endemic fruit fly to the Seychelles called Drosophila seychellia. And then humans, when they came to the Seychelles, they brought some mainland African fruit flies called Drosophila simulans along with them to the Seychelles. And there's now mating between the native Seychelles fruit fly and the African species. And Dan had genomes from a bunch of the Seychellian flies that he thought were either pure simulans or pure Seychellia, or maybe mixtures of the two. And he wanted to know in their genome where was gene flow from the mainland being allowed into the Seychelles, and where did it look like there was no gene flow from the mainland into the Seychelles. And the thought was that maybe there's some genes that are really important for adaptation on the Seychelles, and if you have those alleles, the mainland flies won't be able to get their alleles in. So you'll see a lot of flies on the Seychelles that never have mainland alleles at certain spots in the genome, but then you'll find other spots of the genome that seem to be about mixed. And the idea was that could be a cool way to detect genes that are important for living in the Seychelles. And these flies in the Seychelles have a different diet than the mainland flies and stuff like that. So there's a good hypothesis that might be the case. So what he was trying to do is basically scan the genome of these flies he got from the Seychelles and say, right here, he was going to use a machine learning algorithm to say, right here, this bit of this genome right here didn't come from the Seychelles. This came from the mainland. This is an invasive patch, but the part above and the part below, that looks consistent with the flies I collected from the Seychelles. And so here's Dan's approach. He knew a lot about the evolutionary history of both of these flies, so he could make genetic simulations. They're called coalescence simulations, and unfortunately I won't have time to talk about them very much, but he could simulate training data for his machine learning approach. And what he did is he simulated one kind of genealogy that had no integration between, you can think of this as the Seychelles flies and this is the mainland flies, and this genealogy, the tree perfectly separates and there's no genetic sharing between these. And then he'd simulate another kind where there was integration, and that's this little dotted blue line. So some DNA flowed from, let's say this is the mainland of the Seychelles. So he could simulate DNA sequences that were consistent with either of these two hypotheses, basically. And he could use that as training data. And then what he did is he's a population geneticist, so he created this vector, a feature vector. And remember, that's just a bunch of values you could measure on this DNA that he simulated of all of these population genetic statistics. So he used something like 40 different statistics, and each one of them, they're really simple. They're a mathematical function that takes DNA sequences as an input and outputs a single number. And they all do different things. Like this FST one, it's a number that's very near zero when there's very little differentiation between the two species. So that might be a region of the genome where even if there was integration, there's no way for you to tell because they're so similar to one another, right? So that gives you some information about the extent of differentiation and how much room there is to even detect integration, right? And then he put other ones in that tell you about the amount of gene flow and all these different kind of things. But you can think of this as a vector of 38 values. And then he used a random forest, which is a different kind of machine learning algorithm, which again, I won't have time to talk about. But he trained it because he had simulated this. He trained it as a classifier where he took this vector as an input and he said, okay, there are three possible outputs, either integration from species 1 into species 2, or the reciprocal, or no integration. And since I simulated, I know the right answer, and I got this feature vector of 38 values, and I want this random forest just to learn to take this value of 38 numbers and to translate it into the correct integration or no integration case. And I thought this was like a really cool and clever approach. And again, then he wants to once the thing's trained, he's going to apply it to his real data, and he's going to scan the genome and say, okay, right here there was integration or something like that.
So your training data is from simulation?
Yep, yeah, from simulation. We'll never, I shouldn't say never, but it's going to be really hard. We'd need like a time machine or something like that to be able to go back, right, and get the real integration.
Simulation is kind of evolutionary.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. It's informed by a bunch of theory that tells us about evolutionary biology, and there's definitely a crux here, I think, which maybe you're getting at, is that if these simulations don't mirror the real world very closely, the model will learn some artificial thing and not the real thing. And often in evolutionary biology, this is a problem we face because the thing we're interested in happened, 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago or something like that. But yes, that is right. So it's trained on simulations and then applied to actual data. And so when I looked at his problem in the talk, I realized one thing, that the crux of the whole idea is this feature vector. He's taking a rich DNA sequence, or alignment of multiple DNA sequences, and he's distilling it down into 38 numbers. And that can't possibly capture all the information in that DNA sequence. So the good news is, Dan's a really smart population geneticist, and he used the current state of the art of human knowledge. So he was doing the very best you can, given where we're at today, and or this a couple of years ago, but given where we were at in 2017. The bad news is, we might not be at a very good place, right? Like the current state of human knowledge might be pretty average. A different way to think about this is, imagine that this blue box here is all of the information you'd ever want to know to detect introgression, right? And we have identified little bubbles in this box, which are these population genetic summary statistics, right? And Dan collected all the ones he can. Some of the statistics overlap a little bit with others, but some of them carve out new spaces in this area. And we spent like 100 years as scientists coming up with new little ideas inside this big area, and we're sort of slowly filling the space. And Dan did his best to cover as much of the space as he could. But what we don't know, and we literally don't know, is where the gaps are and what goes in those gaps. So there may be huge gaps in our knowledge of where these statistics should go, and we don't even know how to fill them in yet, right? So his approach would be completely missing all of that information. And so I had some background in image recognition, and I realized there's a real parallel here to the field of image recognition. So for like 50 years, computer scientists and other folks built these handmade feature extractors. These are exactly like our population genetic summary statistics. So they came up with little algorithms. They could take a picture. This algorithm tries to identify circular shapes and give some, but basically this algorithm, if you give it a picture, it tries to identify circles, right? And people spent a lot of time coming up with better circle detectors, right? And better square detectors and edge detectors and all these things. And people thought for decades about how to do this. And all of that research, maybe I'm over-categorizing a little bit, but almost all that research is completely gone and wiped out because neural networks do automatic feature extraction. So when you feed a neural network images of faces, this is some of the insides of a neural network. What it learns is to identify mouth, ears, eyes, nose, right? So it figures out, if I need to detect faces, I got to find ears, eyes, nose, and I got to think about how they're related to one another and all that kind of stuff. Likewise, if I feed it cars, I need to learn about doors and windshields and wheels and stuff like that. And it does this completely automatically and completely in service of best solving the problem. So humans thought for a long time what we need to do is teach this thing about circles or something like that. And we've completely now skipped over that and we say, you know what, neural network, you decide what you need to figure out. You extract the features. We're not going to try to tell you. That's a little bit like saying, we came up with this stuff here in the bubbles, but there's all this space we don't even know about. You go ahead and find that space and characterize it yourself, and you know, we won't even try to bias you with our knowledge of what this problem is like. And so that leads to a pretty obvious thing. I'm going to swap out Dan's, you know, feature vector of these statistics in his random forest. I'm going to swap in a specific type of neural network called a convolutional neural net, and it's exactly like the neural net I told you. But it has one extra little feature, which is it can calculate these convolutions, which you don't need to know a lot about, but mathematically, they're a bit like teaching the algorithm how to zoom in and zoom out. So it allows the algorithm, you remember those numbers, like the 7 and the 1? We were looking at those at a specific resolution. This convolution trick basically allows the algorithm, the neural network, to see that 7 at a really grainy resolution and at a really, you know, high resolution or something like that. So it's just like one extra thing. You can actually, you don't need these convolutions. You can get identically powerful neural networks without convolutions. You just have to train them a lot longer. So anyway, I used a specific type of thing, but it works analogous to the one that I showed you about. And I said, Dan, let's take the thing you did and we'll just swap this in, and maybe it'll do better because it's got access to information that we never thought of. But then the next question was, how am I going to get my alignment of DNA sequences? So these are, imagine these are his fruit flies and these are the nucleotides. How am I going to get that into this convolutional neural network, right? Because it needs numbers as an input. It needs values. And so I thought about this. I thought, okay, I got to convert this into an image. So the first thing I did is I threw out all the invariant sites. So if you look at this matrix, you'll see, okay, no one has any variation at some of these sites. Those are going to be meaningless, right? I can't tell apart two flies from one another if they all have A. Two species, if they all have A at the same position. So the first step was I threw out all of the invariant sites, focused only on the variant sites, and then I encoded them in binary. So, you know, you got T, C, C, C here. That's equivalent, right, to 1, 0, 0, 0, or something like that, right? And we tried different approaches for how you would do this binary encoding, and the long story short is it kind of doesn't matter. You can do it about any way you want as long as you pick a way and you're consistent. The network will learn how to integrate over your particular choice of how you're going to do this binary encoding. Then the next step, once you have this matrix, you can visualize it. And this isn't an exact visual of this matrix. This is a bigger one because this one's tiny and you wouldn't be able to see it. But basically, it's just black and white tiles on a grid, right? And so you can visualize information like this as a weird little barcode image like this one. And this, if you think about it, is not that different than our 28 by 28 handwritten digit image, right? Like I could rearrange these and I could try to make a 7 out of it. And so that gives us some hope that a neural network could take this weird barcode-looking representation of DNA diversity and it could learn something from it. And so that was the first step. So here's Dan's data. This is Drosophila seychellia and Drosophila simulans. Seychellia is an island endemic. It only occurs on the island, and you can see your brain already picks patterns out of this, right? So that gives us a lot of hope that this might work. You can see Seychellia has lots of these bars where everyone's the same, and that's because the population has very little genetic variation. Whereas simulans, these are the guys that came from Africa, they have a ton more genetic variation. So already we can see our brains can already detect the patterns, right? And so that's good because our brains work a little bit like this neural network's can work. And I fed images like this into a neural network, and let's say this one had introgression. So there's a region here, let's say in this particular individual of simulans that's actually derived from Seychellia. It would be hard to see, but you can imagine that the barcode sort of lines up so that it matches the variation up there, right? And what we want is the neural network to be able to discover that and to say, okay, there's introgression from one of these Seychellia into simulans. And so that at the first level, all we want it to do is guess, introgression from one to the other or none, based on little barcode-y images like this. Actually, it's not so little, right? It goes out, it's 1,000 or something like that. And so that was our input. A little bit about the actual training. I used 2 deep learning methods from Google. One's called TensorFlow. This does the math on the back end on the GPU. This gets at a lot of your questions about the deep sort of technical things about gradient descent and stuff. That happens in here. And this Keras thing kind of gets more at your question. This allows you to test different architectures really fast and try different things, and they work with one another. And then we trained it on a GPU on the cloud that we rented from this company called Flagel. They rent them out for 50 cents an hour or something like that. So you could train this model for like $7 or something overnight on the cloud, which is way cheaper than buying one of these multi-$1,000 GPUs for us. And this is a little bit about the architecture. I'm not going to go into too much detail other than tell you that this network had 5 hidden layers. The first 3 were convolutional layers, and then there were 2 fully connected layers, which work exactly like the ones I showed you earlier. So it had 5 total layers. It takes that input image, it sort of scans across it with these convolutions, and then it feeds an output, and the output has a vector of size 3, introgression from 1 into 2, introgression from 2 into 1, and no introgression. And then we compared that, and this is kind of the punchline, we compared that to Dan's method, his random forest method. He gave it a name, he called it FILET. I can't remember what that stands for. But here's FILET, exact same training data, exact same simulated test data. And we found that his algorithm, so this is something called a confusion matrix, and this is the predicted class from his algorithm here is on the columns, and the rows are the true class because we simulated, we know the true answer. And what you'd like to see, the perfect algorithm is going to have all the values on the diagonals and zeros on all the off diagonals, right? What you can see is his achieves on average about 83% accuracy, and the convolutional neural network, same training, same testing, achieved 88% accuracy. And so we were pretty excited about this because Dan had spent a lot of time comparing his method to all the other methods that came before it, and he showed that it beat them by 10 or 15% usually at the same problem. And so we showed we could beat his, which was a darn good approach, by 6% with this neural network. And that gave some, I think, hope to me that his method was missing, that we're starting to fill in, the neural network was starting to learn things that exist outside the bubbles of the information his network had access to. So that's sort of, that was our first taste that, okay, this could actually be pretty useful for population genetics if we can simulate training data and we can encode the problem in a matrix like that. So then we thought, okay, is this like did we just solve this one type of problem, or are there lots of problems that we could solve like this? And so we started attacking a whole bunch of other problems. We looked at detecting the signature of selection. So this is genes in the genome that have been strongly selected by natural selection or not. It turned out our neural network did really well on some problems in this area. I won't go into too much of the details. We also looked at detecting the recombination rate. That's the amount of crossovers that happened in the history of the sample. And we found here that the neural network performed really well. We tried to model population demography. So we tried to train a neural network to guess at what the ancestral population size was for a population given modern samples of its DNA diversity. And we showed there that it did sort of so-so. It wasn't actually that impressive. And there were other more mathematical, more theoretical methods that outperformed our neural network. And then, so we sort of did 4 things, and we found that 3 of them, it did really well, and 1 it didn't. And to be honest with you, we don't yet know the limits and where this is really going to work and where it's not. I think time will tell. Maybe in 10 years, we'll only be using neural networks to detect selection. Maybe in 10 years, we'll never be using it to detect selection, so we'll prove that it was actually a really bad idea, but someone will come up with a clever neural network that does this way better than we did, and it'll be used here. I don't know yet. And then more recently, Dan in his lab started to tackle phylogenetics, which is a particularly, I would say, poorly fit problem for neural networks because the number of phylogenies expands really rapidly with the number of input individuals. It's sort of this like super exponential thing. So he tackled this quartet problem, which is a phylogeny with only 4 taxa. And he showed that at least in this quartet case, neural networks can outperform or can at least keep up with a bunch of existing methods. The problem is going to be scaling that up. This quartet's not that interesting because most people don't want to make phylogenies with 4 taxa anymore. They want to make phylogenies with 50 or 100 or some large number. But he at least showed that in this small case it has promise, and we're kind of just, we're both sort of thinking about ways that you could extend this to larger sizes, but I don't think either of us have quite hit on the answer. And just a quick ad about, if you were interested in this and want to read more, this is our original paper. We gave it this funny title, The Unreasonable Effectiveness. You may, if you know a little bit about the history of machine learning, this title gets recycled all the time in that field. So we decided we should do it too. And then it's only on bioRxiv now. He hasn't published it. This is in a journal called Molecular Biology and Evolution. It came out a few months ago. And then this is Dan's most recent thing. It's on the bioRxiv. And this is if you want to learn more about his approach to phylogenetics using convolutional neural nets. And that's all I have. Thanks for listening. Some quick acknowledgements. My 2 collaborators on the project were Dan Schreider, who I said is now at Chapel Hill, and Yaniv Brandvain. And then normally, this would be the part of the talk where I try to recruit you to my lab, but like I said, I don't have a lab, so I can't recruit you to it. But if you were a grad student or an undergrad, and you're interested in grad school or postdoc or something in this area, if this excites you, I list a few labs here of people who are working in these ideas. So Dan, I definitely recommend at UNC, Yaniv at Minnesota, a guy named Andy Kearns doing a lot of stuff like this at Oregon, Yoon Song at Berkeley, and Katie Pollard's doing really cool things at San Francisco, all kind of in this vein. And I think that's all I got. So if you have questions, I guess I went over. We got